Well, good morning again, and we're going to launch pretty much right into our continuing story of King Saul in the Old Testament. You can begin looking at 1 Samuel chapter 18 as we get ready. But I thought I found something humorous. It was one of the jokes of the week, although I think I've used this before. So if you know this one, maybe I'll ask a little grace. But there's a story about a boss, and he was feeling like he wasn't really getting his proper respect from his employees, and so he decided to get a piece of paper and he wrote a sign on it. It said, "I am the boss," and he taped it to his door. That'll do it. So, that the morning seemed to go okay. And after lunch, he comes back to his office and he noticed a smaller note had been taped over his sign. And that one said, "Your wife called. She wants her sign back." So, yeah, he got the respect. I did think it was a little interesting, though, with the series that we're in, as we've been looking at Saul, and Saul's life is really at this point starting to kind of come apart on him for much the same reason. He's the king, but everything's kind of going wrong for him, and he's even going to be removed as the king eventually. And because of all this, he just feels like he's not getting his proper respect. He feels like everything is going wrong. He knows it. And so he is just unraveling as a king and even as a person. And we have been looking at this along the way and reading his story and recognizing how Saul's fears and insecurities, his failures, the pain of his past, all these things are starting to build up within him. And he's carrying around all this, we've been calling it baggage. He's carrying around all this junk. And he continues to live and to lead out of his baggage instead of becoming the person that God has given him the opportunity, God has called him to be. And how that can be true for many of us, that our experiences, our pain from our past, our failures, our own insecurities, our personalities. We talked about blind spots in our lives. All these things can affect us in how we live our lives and whether or not we are fruitful in the things that we do, whether or not we're becoming the people that God has called us to be. So we're going to look at another little portion of his story in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Beginning at verse 8, and we recognize at this point, David has defeated his giant Goliath, and Saul has invited David to come and live with him, and Saul wants to keep his eye on David all the time, and I don't know the opening part of chapter 18. I can't quite figure out the chronology of what's going on. It seems as though David is given his own little kind of army to lead. Saul sends him off on different missions and things, and David has victories in these missions, but he also is, back playing music for Saul, and it just seems a little mixed up as to how it all lines up, but yet all this is happening, and in the middle of it, in chapter 18, verse 8, it says this: Saul was very angry. Now, we've been there before with him. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And he's jealous here of David. And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house. Another word for that could be raving. He's kind of just going wild in his house. While David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled at him, saying, oops, sorry, my thing just glitched, and it moved my spot. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it at him, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. And so he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Now, last week we talked about a couple of ideas on how we can discover our baggage. How can we uncover and figure out maybe some areas where we might be having trouble? Right in this passage, we see a few things with Saul, don't we? First, we see how he's angry. We see how he's jealous. We see how he's even afraid of losing what he has. And he's living his life out of this baggage. Well, how can we discover baggage in our area? In areas of our life, how can we discover these things that might be influencing us? And then how can we live beyond them or past them? Well, we said there's 3 questions you can ask, and we looked at these last week. 1, what might be keeping you from achieving your identity as a child of God? Are there things, where could you look in your life that are keeping you from becoming who God wants you to be? Number 2, what are your strengths? And could that also be exposing some weaknesses in your life? As we live our lives out of our strengths, are those strengths, do they have the potential of becoming weakness? And then 3, we asked the question, what pain from your past might be causing baggage or blind spots in your life today? And we looked at those through the story. But today, as we talk about this, dealing with baggage in your life, how do we move beyond it? That's where we want to get. We've talked about how bad it is. We've talked about how it can be so detrimental in our lives. We've talked about how all these troubles that Saul has been living with. Hopefully, as we've been going through, you've been thinking of some things. You've been recognizing some things. You've been even saying to yourself, you know what? I want to get better. I don't want to let the baggage control me or manipulate me. And maybe God has even helped you recognize some things in your life from one of those areas. So how do we get beyond it? Simply, I first want to just suggest to you that awareness is often the first step. Awareness and willingness to deal with something in your life is often the first step we can take in trying to overcome and understand our baggage and live beyond it. But I think from our story, there's 3 things that I hope are helpful to you. Perhaps this morning these are just my wild ramblings. I don't know. But as I just looked at the story and I just saw some things going on in it, it just seemed to speak some things to me, and I want to share them with you today. As we go through it, though, as you would be sensitive to the Spirit speaking to you in wanting to deal with your baggage, I invite you out of these 3 items to maybe look for one that might say something to you. One of them that might help you to deal with some issues in your own life. And at the end, I'm going to invite you to pick one that seems to speak to you the most. So here's the first one. Number 1, let your baggage go. Just let your baggage go. Now, I know you're thinking right now, yeah, right, easier said than done. That doesn't seem to be real helpful. But let's learn a lesson from Saul here. Look back at verse 9. If you have the text open, it said that Saul kept a close eye on David. I was wondering, why did he do that? Saul is keeping him close. He's watching him close. He's thinking about him every day. He's just watching everything about it. And he's doing this because he's jealous of David, and this hatred is growing within him. He keeps him close because it continues to make him angry and upset. His thoughts of jealousy and anger are just swirling around in his mind over and over and over again. He's obsessing about David and why he hates him, why he's afraid of him, why he's jealous of him. Everything about David is just tormenting Saul constantly, and yet he's drawing David into his life closer and closer all the while. The more he hates him, the more he can't stop looking at him. The more he's upset and jealous, the more he cannot stop thinking about him. David is rising up to become this great hero of Israel. He's defeated his giant. The ladies are dancing and singing in the street, making up songs to his name. Parades are being thrown in his honor. David is winning every battle and every mission he's sent out on. And King Saul, he could have made the decision to ride the train. He could have made the decision to say, you know, David was my guy. I picked him. I said he could go out and fight Goliath. He could be raising him up, standing on with his arm around David and say, yeah, this is my champion, and isn't he doing a great job for all of us? But he doesn't do that. Instead, he gets even more and more angry with who David is, and he just keeps thinking and obsessing about David. Have you ever found yourself doing anything like that? When something goes wrong, your thoughts return to that issue, to that pain, to that experience, to that failure, to that source of anger, and you just can't let it go, and your mind thinks about it over and over and over. So one day, David is sitting there playing the lyre, which is a stringed instrument, a little bit like a small harp. And he's providing this music for Saul. We addressed, I think it was the second week of this series, how music was a way to calm Saul's spirit. But this time, Saul has just devolved into such a fit of rage that while David is trying to play music and bring soothing harmonies and a relaxing spirit in a way to kind of calm Saul down, it doesn't work. It's not going to happen this time. Instead, he launches into a rage because he's consumed in his jealousy and his anger. And I imagine that stupid little song about David winning his 10,000s and how he's so much better than Saul, it just is going over in his mind again and again and again. And because he has rejected God, and because he's been rebellious, and earlier we saw that God lifts his spirit off of Saul, and he's just kind of left to kind of devolve into this fits of rage, and he reaches a breaking point with all this going on, and he stands up, he grabs a javelin, and he throws it, trying to pin David to the wall. He's actually trying to kill David with a spear. And it's said that David eluded him twice. It seems as though not just once, but when it didn't work the first time, he went after him again. And Saul is consumed with these foul thoughts that take him into this madness. If we want to overcome some of our baggage, we need to start learning how to let go of it, how to set it down. If something's heavy, if some of your memories and experiences are weighing you down, then what if you were able to just set it down and let it go? Recently, I heard of actually a fairly popular pastor of a church of tens of thousands. And it's called Church.tv. Pastor is Craig Rochelle. And he's become a popular speaker and author. He's really taken the idea of multi-site churches and converted it into probably the largest stage in the world. His services at the main campus are broadcast to other campuses all across the country. And even though his church is tens of thousands of people, most of the other satellites are actually larger than his own. He speaks before thousands and thousands of people every week, bringing messages. And what's so interesting about his story is that he says that he is absolutely terrified in speaking in front of crowds. Who'd like to have that job, speaking in front of thousands, if you're terrified of doing it every time? He said when he first became a pastor, in the beginning, he was so terrified he would actually go to the bathroom and throw up first and then take the stage. He was nervous. And so he learned early on that if he was going to be able to do this, he believed this calling was on his life to pastor and to preach and to speak. And he realized that what he had to do is he had to find a way of stepping out of his insecurities and into his identity as a child of God, into the gifting he believed God had given him to do. And so he would go through a little ritual before every sermon. He He would get off to a private place and he would begin to pray for God's wisdom and God's help and courage, and he would visualize himself stepping out of his insecurity, and he would take a step forward as though he was stepping into God's presence, God's identity, and what God was calling him to do, and then he would take the stage and he would give his sermon. And he said, still to this day, many years later, with even larger audiences, he still has to go through, or at least he chooses to go through that ritual of stepping out of his insecurities and failures and into his identity. It got me thinking that I actually do a similar exercise when I deal with my baggage. Sometimes when I feel that my baggage is it's building up, and it's more than I can bear or more than I want to bear, I feel the tension. I realize the anxiety. I recognize that maybe I'm beginning to mistreat people in my lives, or I have a wrong attitude about something. I'll go into a private space and I'll just hold my hands up and begin to pray, and I actually visualize that I'm letting go of whatever it is that's bothering me, and it's just an exercise to let it go and give it to God. Luke 17, I found interesting. Luke 17, 3-4 says, pay attention to yourself. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times saying, I repent, you must forgive him. Now we like to think of this as a verse about whether or not our brother deserves the forgiveness. But what it's really saying is pay particular attention to yourself and how you feel about your brother. We should watch ourselves, watch our thoughts, watch what we're thinking about. Pay attention to yourself. And if you recognize that the baggage is getting a little heavy, find a way to set it down and let it go. You might need to forgive someone. You might need to take your thoughts captive and let go of something. You might need to figure out, what can I do to change my attitude on this issue? You might ask God's help to let it go and to leave it there. And I have found that no, it's not that simple of just doing that. I have to do it over and over and over, sometimes about the very same thing. The very issue that's bothering me, I have to let it go, and then I notice I start picking it up again, and I have to let it go, and I start picking it up again, and I have to let it go. What would it look like if there's pain in your past, if there's insecurities in your life, if there's failures, if there are things that you are dealing with, if there's baggage that you have, what does it look like to let it go? Or will you still let it consume you? Number 2, and I want to say the next 2 issues together, but then I want to break them up. Number 2 is, I think I want to suggest to you that you should do your best, but be satisfied with where you are. That first part, the do your best. Sometimes, it seems to me, sometimes our baggage causes us to be rather self-defeating. Sometimes our baggage causes us to do less than our best. I found it interesting to think of David's current position as a servant to King Saul. Now, we haven't read the entire story. We actually skipped over a little part. It's actually a significant part in the story where David, early on by the prophet Samuel, had already been anointed as the new king of Israel. Now, he hadn't been brought up into the place of the king, but he had been anointed as God's choice. Saul was the people's choice. David, because of his heart for God, would be God's choice. Could you imagine being the person handpicked by God to be the king over all of your personal nation? That no one else in the land had a heart for God or the ability and skill like David to do that job. This is God's man. And David had been anointed to take that spot. No pressure at all. Saul has now sent David out on some missions, and he's been very successful every time. Saul he let David fight Goliath. Goliath fell. David won the battle. David had become and was earning the respect and the admiration of the entire nation. I mean, I mentioned already, they're singing songs about his name and his accomplishments. David did all kinds of great stuff. And in everything he did, he excelled. He did very well. In addition to being a skilled warrior and a great leader, he was also a very excellent musician. Everything he did it the best he possibly could do. He gave it his best. He served in every area of his life, in everything that he did, in every way, in everywhere he was. As I believe as the Bible would call us to do when we serve, to serve as unto the Lord. So whatever the charge was, whatever the job was, whatever he was asked to do, David did it his very best. It seems to me that sometimes our baggage causes us to give less than our best. We give up. We start to live from our excuses. Maybe we become apathetic because we feel like it doesn't make a difference. And we start giving out these half efforts in the areas where we could be giving better. We could be giving more. Sometimes when we're afraid, or sometimes maybe we have failed. And sometimes we just feel like we don't matter, and so we retreat and we give up. I want to suggest to you that success, working hard, meeting challenges, is sometimes the best way to overcome some of the insecurities that you have. Fighting once again, getting up and trying another time, giving it your best, it can sometimes be the greatest way of overcoming baggage in your life. When you feel defeated, face your giant. When you feel like you've made mistakes, try again. Sometimes it's not about seeing the fruit or doing well the first time. It's the continual time. It's never giving up. It's always pressing ahead. It's always moving forward. It's always seeking after God and whatever He might be calling you into. Oftentimes I found in my life, especially when it comes to serving the Lord, we have to look at this life as a marathon instead of a sprint. Because rarely do we see impact. Rarely do we see things changing. Rarely do we see fruit in the first half of the game, in the first part of the journey. It's only through sticking with it, through hanging in there, being consistent, and giving the very best that we have to give, that we start seeing the results of God working in and through our lives. And so my suggestion is that one way to overcome baggage is to simply do the best you can do, to do better the next time. And I wanted to kind of throw in that little, almost a caveat before the last one, to recognize that we want to do our best, yet at the same time, it seems like we need to be satisfied with where we're at. And I thought that's what amazed me so much about David at this point. His level of satisfaction with what God had given him to do. I mentioned by this time in our story, David had been anointed by the prophet Samuel to be the new king. He's defeated the giant Goliath. He was the champion of the nation. People were singing and dancing around him. He'd become this great leader of his own army, and his men followed him and they loved him. And compare the job he was doing in contrast to the job that Saul is doing. He's awful. He's a tyrant. He has no heart for God. They can even see that that the Spirit of God is lifted from him, and he goes into these fits and into these rages. And yet David, who by all means, as you look at this, he could have easily been arrogant and prideful. He knew where his life was going. He was the man on the rise. Saul was the guy that was going down. But David humbly does what he's asked. He just does what he's asked to do. When Saul offers him riches, when Saul offers him to take one of his daughters as his own wife, he declines. David is completely satisfied with whatever God gives to him. And he would be patient until God brought him into a new chapter in his life. He even plays almost this, here's David as this great warrior now, this great man. He's being held up as a champion of the nation. And yet his role back home is that almost of the court jester. He's a guy just called in to make Saul feel better by playing his music. That's got to play with your emotions a little bit. He knows the track that God has him on, but he can't get there yet. He knows that he's done great things and he's bested every challenge in front of him. And yet he's reduced back down just to sitting in a corner and playing his harp. It reminded me of the Apostle Paul, who said, I have had nothing and I've had plenty. I have been well fed. I've gone hungry. I know what it's like to have a lot. I know what it's like to have little. And then he says, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. He says, what is the secret? Paul says, the secret is this. He's learned, and that gave me pause to think myself. Paul said he had to learn this. How we need to learn to be content in any and every situation. Paul writes, he says this is how he learned it. He learned it because I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Paul's saying that God has taught him how to be satisfied with his life and where he's at. How much of our baggage, how much of our insecurities, how much of our fears, how much of our anger is the result of feeling like I'm not getting what I deserve. I'm not being treated fairly. I don't have what somebody else has. How much of our baggage is the result of feeling like I don't get what I think belongs to me? And we have a sense of great injustice. I think maybe one of our favorite phrases to say is, life just isn't fair. And we like to ride it like a racehorse pony. It's just not fair. But it's not. And so Paul from the New Testament says, I had to learn. Paul is a guy that, interesting, he has the same name, Saul, before he became a Christian. And he was the head of armies. He was a leader. He probably had wealth, or at least it was growing. And he loses everything to start serving God. He says, hey, I know what it's like to have everything. I know what it's like to have nothing. And God taught me to be satisfied with what he gives. Which one of these might speak to you? Is your current battle with your baggage an issue of your thoughts? Is it an issue of your actions? Or is it an issue of your heart? Which one might speak to you? And we're going to kind of close a little differently this morning. I think we'll do this now. I'll invite Diane's going to come back up, and I think Barb's going to help with one of the songs we sang earlier. And I want to close this in prayer and just kind of pray back through and think back through these three areas. And while we do, just be sensitive if the Lord might challenge you in one area. Is there one of those areas where you want to grow in dealing with your baggage? Whatever it might be, wherever it might be. And so let's ask the Spirit of God to speak to us. Father,